Here we go. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to this event. I'm so thrilled that you're here. I'm Susan Zieger. I'm one of the co-editors of Assembly Codes. And we'll have a few introductory remarks. And then we'll hear from each of our contributors. We'll have some time for questions and conversation, and then we'll finish up. So I'm expecting all that to take an hour, but we have more time in the Zoom session if people want to linger and chat a little bit longer. So that's the map of our program today. So this event is hosted by the Center for Ideas in Society at UC Riverside. And we have here one of the co-directors of the center, Nicole, who is going to give you the fastest institutional introduction you have ever heard.
Thank you, Susan. So I didn't want to miss the opportunity to extend, the center's warmest welcome to this event. Also from my co-director Dylan, who promised to Zoom in later on to this book launch today. So when I saw this invitation, my first thought was, what a great idea. Why did I not do this with my previous volumes? I never did. So I really think it's a great idea. And I wanted to thank the organizers. I wanted to thank Susan and Nicole and Matt for organizing this together with the center. And as I promised I could do this in 30 seconds, I'm going to stick to my promise. So welcome everyone from the center. And I'm very curious to learn more about assembly codes and the logistics of media. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. And so now I think, Nicole, if you're ready, and then after you, Matt, if you could start us off.
Welcome, everyone. It's really great to see you all. And also, I think some of you I haven't met who are actually contributors. So this is just like a really awesome chance to engage, I think, amongst us as well as to promote our awesome book. So I'm not going to say too much because I kind of want to get onto everybody's thoughts, questions, and discussion. But I will say that I think that Susan was the one who prompted the conception of an edited collection. And then I think we roped Matt on board, although this was all many years ago. So that was the genesis. And then from there, we picked just the most amazing people. And so that's how it all came to be. And I think that one of the things that I really hoped with this collection is I think that the study of logistics in media studies, and then the kind of widespread recognition of media in the study of logistics seemed like two areas where there was a lot of productive energy and interest. And so our hope with this collection was to kind of draw those two sets of people to read the same thing and maybe read each other's works and to generate new kinds of conversations. And so I feel like it has done that, although you haven't all read it yet and had a chance to do so. I guess this is just to say welcome, and I'm going to toss it over to Matt at this point.
Well, thanks, Nicole and Susan. Yeah, Susan and I were talking just a little bit before everybody hopped on about how long we've been working on this, and it's hard to remember. So much has happened over the past couple of years that it's really hard to put together. But in so many ways, I think, this is the perfect worst moment for this book because there's so much going on thinking about logistics right now. And, the worry about delays and shortages and backed up container ships, but also, seeing people in publishing talk about the worry that, books aren't going to be able to come out because of the publishing supply chain. There's a crisis in, the vinyl supply chain right now. And, we've all been maybe dealing with, graphics card problems and chip shortages and not being able to get stuff. And I think that really sheds some light, brings some attention to how important logistics is to media, and in a lot of ways, how important media is to logistics. And so I'm, happy, not happy that the book is coming out in this moment, in the midst of all this, attention. And hopefully, as all of our contributors have thought about these issues, other people will take some of the things that we raise and try to unpack, this behemoth that is, the way the world works now, and try to come up with something that is, more sustainable, better for human beings, and carries with it hopes for a better future in media and in logistics. And I think that's all I want to say. So
it's like, there you
Susan?
go, Matt, giving us a hopeful future after all of
I'm
that.
I'm trying, but
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, and so now John Durham Peters has written our foreword, and John, we would love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. One of the great things about books is that they bring people together, and you don't have to read them necessarily to be brought together. So this is it's very exciting to be here today. And I think this is echoing Matt's comment, but I've been thinking about the old Latin phrase about habent sua fata libelli, books have their fate, and about the exquisitely perfect, horrible moment for this book to emerge into a world. By way of advertising, I can tell you that this book, with its very beautiful cover, appeared in February of 2020, which is not a good time to be publishing a book on any subject that is not related to pandemic or to questions of justice. And the book landed with a total thud, which maybe it deserved to. This book is not going to land with a total thud because it so much speaks to our moment, but also because it has a couple kind of really interesting interventions in larger debates. One is the hunt for a vocabulary. One of the things that I note in the preface is just the wild array of terms which are being sought for to talk about this stuff in the middle, this all the materiality of ensembles and infrastructures and logistics. And I think this is really exciting. And the second thing that I see about this book, it's a direct response to the idea, which has been floated around in philosophy for a long time and is a kind of cultural bias, and it's probably an ultimately misogynistic bias, that things having to do with matter, M-A-T-T-E-R, M-A-T-E-R, are things which are not poetic, not beautiful, not wonderful. William James, the great philosopher, in defending a kind of materialist approach, was making fun of the enemies of materialism who call it the mud philosophy. He's saying it's obviously not mud philosophy because the most beautiful things in the world are made out of matter. And in this book, many of the entries continually wax lyrical, and they go poetic. And this is of course is a tradition in poetics, maybe from Whitman to Sandburg to Jane Bennett, who's an avid reader of Whitman, of course. I mean, how do you get the poetry of mud, of materiality, of being in the world of compost? And I really do see this volume as a contribution to the ongoing effort to show that questions of logistics are not only important and essential and vital politically and environmentally and economically and ethically in terms of justice, but they're also beautiful. So that's my thought.
Thank you so much, John. That's a lovely way for us to begin. So I'm grateful. Okay, we're going to hear from our contributors now, and we're going to start actually with the final contribution to the volume, which is by Tung-Hui.
Hi, and thanks, Susan, Matt, and Nicole, for making this happen, and to my co-contributors who are rock stars. It's cool to finally see you on Zoom. So when Susan asked me to do this, I thought I was done writing about servers and clouds and data centers, and I said, no way, I don't have anything for you. I wanted to think about things like film or performance or even dance. But she planted that idea in my mind of logistics, and I kept thinking about it in the following months. I read something about how the 100,000 robots and the 565,000 workers in Amazon warehouses are coordinated in a delicate dance. And more generally, I was thinking about how bodies and information, humans and non-humans, are coordinated next to each other. in all the technological platforms out there. So I was like, oh, maybe dance and logistics are actually related in some way. Maybe there's something more to this idea. Then I came across this artwork in Mexico City, Yoshua Ocon's Canned Laughter, which is the subject of this piece. And I'll quickly describe it. It depicts a maquiladora. He rented the former space of one. He hired the former workers there, and he creates a fake factory for canning laughter. Sexy laughter, witches laughter. And on it, you can see a chorus of workers, laughing in unison as the conductor conducts them. There are people testing cans on an assembly line and so on. And what struck me about that is that it's sort of like it seemed like a really good allegory for the system by which emotional labor is exported from the global South. I was thinking about three things. One, the Kenyan workers for Sonosource who teach AI how to recognize laughter, how to distinguish between a sad laugh and a happy frown or something. And so they spend their days tagging videos repetitively over and over. I was thinking about Bangladeshi workers that click on like and sell likes by the thousand for celebrities or wannabe celebrities. And I was thinking about customer service workers whose job it is to provide some sort of empathy or care for their customers, all forms of emotional labor that sort of get reassembled by algorithm and delivered to user screens. We often see those kinds of work as fake, as robotic, as stilted, thinking about a customer service worker as some sort of bad imitation of an American one. But as I think I try to argue in my contribution, these moments of fake or canned or staleness are important because they flatten this idea of what I think of as an oppressively vital system, which says that humanness is genuine and authentic and carries emotion. But as we know from works ranging from Sian Nai or Kalindi Vora and Neda Tanasowski's new books, this is also what holds at whiteness, right? That it makes the person of color a robot or is animated from without, right? So like if you're an Asian or Asian American, you literally are seen as a robot. And so I think what I ultimately end up saying is, what happens if we lean into being a robot? What happens if we lean into being canned? What happens if we devitalize technology, make it just a little bit lethargic? What kinds of different ways of being might that open up? Thanks. I hope to see you guys in real life someday also. See you guys later.
Thank you so much, Wei. That's fabulous. We'll move on now to Ebony Coletu.
Thanks so much. I thought if it makes sense, since many people probably haven't had a chance to read the book yet, I'll just give a quick explanation for what made this such an interesting provocation for me. I'd actually already been thinking about logistics in the context of Pan-Africanism. So I guess what I was approaching was slightly different, maybe than some of the other contributions, because I was thinking about this interesting way that Pan-Africanism really has a logistical question at its core. And that is the idea of an African diaspora being dispersed through Atlantic slavery, and this is vis-a-vis the US particularly, but also Brazil, obviously, so the Americas. But the dispersal of Africans is a fundamental question about shipping. And war and conflict. So I really appreciated the way that the project really took that as a kind of basic feature of the logistical question about how we got that way. And then I thought maybe Pan-Africanism in one slice of it is always preoccupied with the obstacles placed in the path of return, or the obstacles placed in the path of collective organizing of global Africans. So what I did was focus on one particular movement, which is from the early 20th century. And, people have studied the movement, but for the most part, it's kind of overshadowed by Marcus Garvey, who came a few years later. But this person who organized it, Alfred Sam, was the impetus for Marcus Garvey to decide that he wanted a shipping line yoked together with a global movement and diasporic return at its core. So I thought, let's just go back to this particular movement that many considered a failure and ask what made it so tricky and why logistics was actually part of the idea of diasporic return itself. So the two things that were interesting is that money was usually a problem with return. People didn't have enough money to just power themselves back. Two, kinship was a problem. Where did you actually come from? Who are you related to? Who's going to receive you? And then three, politics, like who are you in solidarity with? How can you organize collectively to have a life elsewhere from where you were actually raised? And so Alfred Sam actually organized to answer all these three questions by developing a shipping company and selling stocks to African Americans from 1912 to 1914 and offering them for $25. They could come to the Gold Coast and set up a village together and have collectively owned property and build an industrial town, essentially, to alter the dynamics of African trade such that the diaspora would be more tightly connected to West Africa and European dominance could be unsettled somehow. So it was a big vision, a big project. And what I thought was so fascinating about it was not that it didn't quite live up to its charge, but that it was so thoughtfully about these three obstacles to return. So Sam was a chief. He became a chief right at the beginning. And he said, look, because I'm chief, I'm going to solve the kinship problem. Foreigners can't own land here, but I'm going to adopt you as the distant kin that you are, and you will become Africans again. So this was right at the beginnings of really African consciousness being a strong tie to cut across colonial boundaries. The second thing was economic solidarity, thinking about how that $25 could actually do a lot more together. You know, Marcus Garvey would echo this over and over again. The third thing, which connects it to the logistics I think other people are talking about as well, is that, you know, they had to think through the politics of it in a time of war. So 1914, they set sail from Galveston, Texas, and immediately they're targeted by the British Navy and brought to, you know, martial trial for having a wireless machine on ship. They are interrogated. And in fact, they do not lose this trial. They win because of the solidarity that had been forming in this African consciousness in neighboring African states, and not yet states, but colonies. They started to convince people that diasporic return of this particular kind was actually heralding a new economic era for all of West Africa. So this was the prelude to the British West Africa Conference. It was kind of an exciting time. Now, the downside of it is that the movement's largely forgotten because the British instituted a head tax in order to financially disincentivize masses of people coming from the US to the Gold Coast. And those people who did stay blended in, decided to take the kinship seriously and did not pay the head tax, those who remained, and they disappeared from this distinct identity as migrants. And so part of the logistical angle, I think, that's useful is that it allows you to get granular on some of those techniques that we might consider part of the Pan-African imagination, and that I say are also quite clearly part of a logistical imagination about how Pan-Africanism becomes realized in this moment. So I'll go ahead and leave it there.
Thank you so much, Ebony. It's such a fantastic essay, and it's great to hear the backstory of it as well. Okay, Shannon, Mattern, you're next.
Hi, everybody. I have had the pleasure of working with Matt and Nicole on several projects over the years, so I was really delighted to join them again and to meet and have an opportunity to work with Susan. I have done some projects in the past about mapping mapping mostly infrastructural systems, and then became interested several years ago about what escapes the visual, what doesn't lend itself to a more ocular-centric form of mapping. So I wondered what we could learn about logistics by listening to it. And I know I'm just realizing you explicitly told us not to read, but I'm going to read one paragraph. I hope that's okay, because I think it distills pretty succinctly the range of things that I cover in this book. So I talk about how logistics both compels and conditions different modes of listening. Diagnostic, orientational, and defensive listening enable everybody from dock workers and deckhands and soldiers and factory workers and maintenance workers to appraise the proper functioning of the system, whatever their system might be, to coordinate actions, both compliant and disruptive, to assess their own safety, and if necessary, to get out of harm's way. Ethical or critical listening can help us to tune into the system's power dynamics and to recognize and even emphasize logistical subjects, including those on the other end of the supply chain. Critical listening would benefit from an outsider's perspective. I also argue how it's like all modes of listening can take place from anywhere, at a dock, in the fields, at the supermarkets. Listening as method, as I try to explain in the piece, is particularly well suited for thinking across logistics scales of operation, attuned to the resonances between the micro and the macro. We can lend an ear to local operations and attend to individual logistical agents while also listening from a remove across space and time through abstraction or speculation to sound out big patterns and macro scale rhythms, can extrapolate from the sonic qualities of particular logistical nodes, from cacophony of the battlefield to the quiet respite at the bow of a container ship, to index the flow of goods and capital, bodies and affect. Logistics also offers us countless sonic stimuli for our consideration. Languages, both natural and artificial, environmental sounds, objects' resonances, electronic signals, and machine rhythms. Such a crowded acoustic field has made it increasingly necessary for us to supplement our own ears with machinic sensors and algorithmic processors, creating us as cyborgian listening subjects. In the piece, I look across everything from the slave ship to the cotton field, the battlefield, the factory floor, the seaport, center, the control center for kind of global transportation systems, just to see how these different modes of logistics allow us to understand logistical systems from the individual node, the micro scale, to the larger scale system. So that is my contribution, and I'm happy to be a part of this illustrious group. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Shannon. It's a great essay, and I'm so glad it's in the volume. Next, we're going to hear from Liam Cole-Young.
Hi, everyone. Excuse me. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thanks to the editors for their superhuman efforts in bringing this thing together, and Courtney Berger and everyone at Duke for getting us to port. This is one of the first edited volumes I've been a part of, so to echo, something John said, it's kind of wonderful how a book can bring people together, and certainly what a group this is. It's a total privilege for me. When you're early career like I am, you kind of always feel like an imposter of some kind, but I've never felt more like an imposter perhaps than right now. So anyway, my chapter arises from this kind of ongoing interest I've had in the techniques of colonization, which is something we think a lot about here in Canada, where I am. So I've been thinking a lot in recent years about salt, the kind of media history of salt, or the logistics of this seemingly banal, but absolutely vital and consequential substance. So that project has obviously taken me into this realm of sort of deep histories of colonization, which are obviously always logistical. And this volume and invitation came along at a really great and kind of crucial moment for that project, because it forced me or invited me to think more broadly about this relationship between logistics and colonization. So what are the infrastructures, practices, forms, media technologies by which the structure of colonization kind of unfolds and settles into place over time? So I come from media theory, which I think has a pretty good language for thinking about these types of things as processes of inscription. So how things get built into and over the world, or inscribed into the world, who builds them, for what purposes. And I've learned a lot over the years from our colleagues working in settler colonial and Indigenous studies about the kind of political stakes and implications of these operations, many of which we know unfold under the cover of European ideas like progress, enlightenment, and cultivation, and these types of things. So what I tried to do in my contribution was kind of invite these literatures together, media theory and settler colonial studies, by bending certain concepts and methods of each toward the imperatives and commitments of the other. So one of the concepts by which I do this is logistical media, which is a concept that many of us have borrowed from John Peters, who develops it to remind us in a really helpful way that, mediation in our lives is as often occurring through the boring and everyday. So things like administration, transportation, counting, filing, these types of things. So it's as often through those seemingly banal forms as it is through media of spectacle or communication. So I think of logistical media as comprising deep infrastructures through which culture, politics, and other forms of social activity unfold. So though they appear banal, they're deeply consequential, right? Power is always located at the switchboards, which I think is something John said in describing that concept. So colonization has obviously always been this kind of infrastructural project, as people like Sherry Pasternak, Deb Cowan, Tia Daphnos, Eve Tuck, Wayne Yang say. So it seemed to me that this concept of logistical media might help, provide a productive framework to answer some calls from settler colonial studies to not take colonialism or colonization for granted, but to follow its operations, observe the protocols and practices by which it takes shape. So in my essay, I kind of use it to invite together these seemingly divergent realms of navigation and paperwork. So my two case studies are the tall ship and the document. But also it invites in kind of broader questions around those things, involving things like extraction, exchange, communication. So the two case studies, kind of work through some of these operations. So the way that a ship renders land and sea interoperable. So the ship accepts both foot and water line. It brings land onto sea. It renders the sea navigable, a medium. The ship is a medium for expansion and extraction. So that's an example just of using some of the terms that circulate widely in media theory to bring a little bit more precision to something like the idea of transportation. So we all know ships transport people, but what are the various operations or techniques that make this kind of broad process of transportation possible? And then similarly with the case study of the document, so I look at something like the Hudson's Bay Charter of 1670, which is a document that kind of inscribes a certain kind of European ontology or a series of protocols, over land and people and waters, bringing them under the sway of European logistics. So that there I'm using a term like inscription sort of, literally to think about material techniques by which documents get made, but then also as a metaphor for this broader kind of overarching logic. And inscription, I like this term a lot because in media theory, theorists like Cornelia Wiesmann remind us that inscription is never complete or perfect, right? It always leaves traces. There are gaps. It never entirely cancels what came before. And this is a point that is made continuously by indigenous and indigenist scholars who are trying to kind of continuously recenter traditional knowledges, traditions. And if I can say so, these communities own logistical media. So things like canoes and wampum belts, carvings, practices of gift giving, dance, and other musical traditions. So these are media that establish basic parameters of experience and community that don't abide by European logics and which crucially remain present. So I'll just wrap by saying, kind of bringing together media theory and settler colonial studies is about seeing colonization both as an ongoing process of inscription, but also importantly, as techniques of resistance and refusal. And that, I hope anyway, can help deflate some of these narratives that still circulate about North America that presume like from nothing came something 150 years ago or 400 years ago or whatever colonial origin point may be posited. So I'll leave it there. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, Liam. That's such a rich encapsulation, and it's such an important intervention and essay. Now we welcome Ned Rossiter, joining us from Sydney.
Yeah, thank you very much, Susan, and good morning, everyone from Sydney. It usually takes until midday before my brain starts to congeal in some kind of coherent fashion, and I'm rarely out of bed, to be frank, at this time of the day. So it will be a little bit of a struggle, I think, for me. But anyway, I'm really delighted as well to be joining you all. I usually don't participate in book launches or indeed have them. I think one of the reasons for that has to do with this uncomfortable kind of dissociation. I don't think this is uncommon. This uncomfortable dissociation I experience from the kind of intensity and immersion of writing and the event or occasion of the publication or book itself. So for me, I feel deeply alienated from what I've written and struggle to kind of recall any of its nuance or argument. And it's sort of a history of some other person, but not me. So this sort of event is a little bit, traumatic without wanting to be too dramatic, because it forces you to revisit the sort of scene of crime in a way. Not that it was unpleasant. It was a delightful experience, I've got to say, writing this. I found the work of sort of collaborating really with the editors, particularly Susan, immensely satisfying. And in fact, for me personally, this is in my top 3 pieces for sure. I'm deeply kind of proud of it, for all of its faults and messiness and contradictions and incoherence and things like that, which I'm discovering as I review it for this occasion this morning. So I'll get on to some of those contradictions in a second. I really didn't want to be longer. I thought I'd be finished by now. I thought, aside from pointing out some of those contradictions, just the process of writing might be something to talk a little bit about as well. Because like much of what I do, it's terribly fragmented and sort of cobbled together. And the essay form is a genre which it gives you the license, or at least I feel like it does, for me to kind of compress component parts together. So actually the paper talk chapter rather starts off as notes from a job talk that I had in Berlin, and thankfully I really never got that job. Half the people hated me. I won't name who, but certain media theorists. And but nevertheless, it sort of was exciting for me to think of something like provincial thought and what this might mean for media theory. And the idea that we're always already provincial, no matter how kind of cosmopolitan we might kind of assume ourselves to be. And so what does that mean? Coming to Liam's point around interoperability, is one of the key interests I guess I have, is this tension between, in approaching media and logistics, is the tension between interoperability, with the things that make the world go round, and inoperability, these moments of disruption, of crisis, and wishing to think a political theory of media. That kind of tension I found in the work that we've done collectively on global logistics is one that enables us to start identifying the instantiation of the political outside of more classical political theory. And logistics offers many of those occasions, of course, because of the way it's so susceptible and prone to breaking down. I'll try and wrap up really quickly. One of the key interests of this essay is to think the abstract and technical concept of the interval, and how this provides something of a refuge from the computational society and economy of accountability. And accountability, as I think many of us have experienced all too frequently in the last 2 years, is something that's really become amplified within university settings during the ongoing crisis. And so I was interested in how the interval may offer a kind of micro-temporality, to draw on some of Florian Sprenger's work, of escape. The strange couplings in the essay work around things like the provincial and geopolitics, as I've mentioned. I've discovered not a lot is said about geopolitics in that piece. Time and space, not such an unusual coupling at all, but time as chronopolitics, to draw on Wolfgang Ernst, runs differently to time as space as geopolitics. And then really the key one for me was the idea of the interval and decisionism. I'll finish just by pointing to something completely else that I've recently discovered that I find intriguing. And this is the work of the Italian minimalist composer Caterina Barberi, and she speaks recently about how she stretches and resizes the interval of sound in remixing, in the process of remixing. I'll drop a link in for her work later for you. But I'm so fascinated, I guess, to think through other forms of and media of expression, to see how we draw out our concepts from different kind of empirical conditions. Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you, Ned, and thank you for your compliments, and the interval is such an important concept. I'm so glad that the essay is in the volume. We turn now to Michael Palm.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And to share a Zoom room with some scholars that I've long admired, and I think even more exciting to be here with some people that I don't know and haven't met, and to be able to share this book for you, which was a real a real accomplishment for me. I never had this experience before, but when Matt approached me about contributing to it, he asked about some previous work I had done, and it was the first time I was ever able to say, like, you got to hear the new stuff. Like that's what's going to really fit here, and I'm really delighted that it turned out to fit. And it was this my chapter about shipping along the supply chains for new and used records today is part of a larger project that was new when Matt approached me to contribute. It's no longer new, but it is still in progress, still working on it. And just to echo what Ned said and what Shannon said about Matt and Susan and Nicole as editors, and to put a more self-serving point on it, I'm very grateful for some really incisive feedback that I got on this chapter at what was a very formative time for this larger project. So I think the two things that I just wanted to highlight that my chapter contributes, and they're certainly not unique among the chapters in the book, but the one is the idea of what I call post-digital media logistics, and the other is a kind of ecological consideration of some of the materiality of distribution along with production and consumption of popular culture. So vinyl records, as I'm sure you're aware, get their fair share of attention as this kind of analog exception, in our digitally saturated media landscape. And so I get a lot of mileage out of this concept of the post-digital as a way to kind of bring those together, rather than highlighting the differences between the digital and the non-digital. The post-digital is largely used as an experiential or an aesthetic category. And so what was really useful for me in this chapter, and that I hope contributed to the book, was to be able to think about it, and to apply it to a logistical setting. And so, I talk about the tracking number as this as a post-digital logistical media par excellence, that kind of links the digital and the non-digital in a logistical sense. And I spend a lot of time analyzing the significance of shipping and delivery, both in the production of new records and then in the trafficking of new and used records alike. There's one anecdote that I relay from a manufacturing conference where a bunch of proprietors of new plants, record pressing plants that have popped up in the last couple of years, are talking about their razor thin profit margins and the severe economy of scale. And one of them says, trust me, nobody's getting rich from this. And another one of the panelists said, well, except UPS and FedEx. And everybody laughed and chuckled and, kind of acknowledged the centrality of shipping. And similarly, I think that when, vinyl tends to be thought of in terms of consumption, and in an ecological sense, it's often compared to streaming in these black and white either or ways, where people either point out that it takes a lot less energy to spin a turntable than it does to stream music through a platform infrastructure, or people like to point out that vinyl records are, after all, non-biodegradable plastic, and we might want to think twice before introducing more of them into the world when we can stream and listen to music in some of these other ways. And so, in ecological terms, what I was hoping to do was not to argue one way or the other in terms of various music media being more or less green than others, but to point out, to use this the framework of logistical media to open up some of the complexity of thinking about not just the ecology of production and consumption, but distribution and trafficking as well, where we see a situation where even for used records, which are in a sense green in that they're being resold, which is not something that happens a lot with media anymore today, with the exception of something like paperback books. And the vast majority of records today that are bought and sold are on at least their second owner. But those sales are happening through online markets, which are expanding and accelerating those markets, and then leading to a vast increase in the amount of resources, both in terms of the energy used to fuel the logistical infrastructure, but also in terms of things like boxes and tapes and gasoline that goes into moving them from A to B in the real world. And lastly, maybe just I'll add one point, that I've kind of developed out of the work that Matt and Nicole and Susan helped me do with this chapter, is that there's also a redistribution of the records themselves now in a process that I've started to call, in historical terms rather than geographical terms, the gentrification of vinyl, because those online markets are allowing wealthier and whiter consumers to basically poach the used records from markets in places like the US South, where I'm located in North Carolina, and we're seeing those redistributed to wealthy collectors in Japan and UK and in some of the global centers in the US. So again, very grateful for the opportunity to present and to be here with you, and to Matt and Susan and Nicole for helping me develop this work.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's a great essay, and it really, it makes one of the points of the collection that manufacturing and distribution really need to be theorized and discussed together. So I'm glad it's in the volume. Our last speaker is Kay Dickinson, and after she talks about her essay, we'll have time for questions from the audience.
Thanks. And I want to echo the thanks to the editors, but also to mention just how much I love the little interlude sequences you worked into the book to link all the chapters in a kind of counter-logistical fashion. I thought that was eloquent and poetic, and I'm so in love with what you did with that. So my essay is one that really takes the subtitle of logistics of media to kind of mean the logistics of making media products, and specifically in the case of this essay, big budget cinema. So I'm particularly interested in what I'm calling supply chain cinema, in effect a transnationalized mode of production that kind of orchestrates difference for advantage, all these things we know from people like Anna Singh, but in the cinematic context too, subcontracting, the deliberate relinquishing of kind of responsibility to employees, offshoring, looking for tax loops and ways to avoid territorial loyalty. So in sum, this is actually how most big budget feature films get made. And I really just wanted to kind of say, hey guys, it functions like a supply chain at that level too. So because we were writing these very snappy papers, I zoned in on just one site. I'm working on this in a bigger way with other kind of locations, but for this paper, I was looking at Leavesden Studios, which is now a permanent Warner Brothers base just outside London. And you've likely, if you watch movies, seen a movie that was shot or partially shot there, Mission Impossible, Wonder Woman, the entire Harry Potter franchise, and it goes on. And actually, Hollywood shoots more in London than it does in Southern California right now. So offshoring a go-go. Yes, I'm interested in this sort of the obvious logistification of just how do you coordinate a transnational multi-sited production? How do you kind of what's the traffic in people and equipment and so forth? But I'm probably more interested in how supply chain cinema is expanding the principles that we generally associate with the supply chain. So like I said before, tax breaks, offshoring, less organized, precarious labor. And then in London, you have Hollywood taking advantage of a universal healthcare system so as not to pay insurance. So the idea that, various states or other entities absorb the costs and the responsibility is a very supply chain kind of approach. Okay, so, but that's one part. And then really, I think what I'm even more interested in is how the supply chain, or we, through the supply chain, craft a subjectivity for a labourer or for just, kind of anyone contributing generally. So this can only work if we have a workforce that is aspiring, if not willing, to be subcontracted, to be self-sufficient, entrepreneurial, working dangerously long hours. That's very rarely sort of acknowledged in film, that there are frequent injuries with all this heavy equipment, and an increasing number of fatalities of filmmakers. Doing my research, I've come across film personnel who like drive home after a 14, 15, maybe 16-hour shift, slapping their faces to stay awake. So we think of it as a sort of luxury job, but in actual fact, it's a very dangerous job too, and needs to be thought about in these ways. Really, I think where my essay turns, kind of towards perhaps us in the room, is that I'm very interested in how higher education becomes a key feeder to supply chain production techniques. What kinds of education are those of us that teach giving that feeds into this? What sorts of aspirations do students wishing to work in the industry seek to hone? And I'm looking at that within the nexus of, increased work-related learning, the indebtedness of students, so that when they enter supply chain cinema, they're already kind of compromised in various financial and sort of responsibility fashions. That we have internships that students pay for to work for free, which again, it sort of duplicates the free labor model. Ned mentioned interoperability, which is in my larger project is really central. The idea of creating like a sort of global liberal education where we can all communicate with each other, smooth over the gaps of a transnationalized production system, and really thinking about what is the cost of rendering, subjects and workers interoperable in that way. And my larger project features the Global South a lot more than this essay, the economies and politics of conformity, of indebtedness, of temporary labor migration, and the risks and kind of gambles that involves. So yeah, like I said, I'm ultimately trying to bring critical logistical studies back home to media, to those who teach media, to those who study media, to those who wish to work in that industry, and to not think of it as any different from, it is different, but so think of it as interconnected with how we think about supply chains in other sectors. And yeah, there's also a Harry Potter focus in the essay, and I really don't like Harry Potter, so I'm hoping I never sort of incur the wrath of Harry Potter fans when I'm sort of presenting this work. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Kay, and thank you for all the marvelous things that essay does, but also for mentioning the turn to students and their college education and the supply chain. That's something that I think we think about at UCR a lot. So, all right, thank you everyone who just spoke, all of our contributors, you're so wonderful. Let me ask our audience, if you have a question, I invite you to either write it in the chat or to unmute yourself and ask it directly.
I've got a dumb one, just assembly codes. How did you come up with that for your title?
I think that could be a question for Matt to answer.
Yeah, it's Matt. Matt came up with it. So if you like it or don't like it, it's Matt. It's
my fault. Yeah, it's and there was some pushback on the title. So, if you don't like it, you have some company. But I liked thinking, about, assembly code, computer assembly code, and thinking about what assembly code is, which is basically, directions to, a computer system about what memory locations have values. And so it's, it's a very low level, mundane, logistical kind of language. And, thinking about global logistics today, to position media within it as analogous to that kind of language made a lot of sense to me. And I thought there was something, maybe, as John suggested, poetic about that sort of comparison a little bit. But again, it was, not universally loved, but
Lorenzo, did that answer your question about low-level programming?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
I have a question for everyone. Oh no, Kay has a question. You can go first.
I have a question for you guys, actually, which is, I mean, I just mentioned those little sections you wrote that link the chapters. I'd love to hear more about like how you got them together, what were you working from the essays, or did you have them in mind beforehand? I think they're really unique.
Thanks, Kay. I could, any of us can answer. I'll start off by saying that they were little things that I think we all had in mind, or we each had in mind some of those topics, and somehow they had not kind of come up, I guess, in any of the essays. And we thought, how can we, I don't know, that's my memory of it. How can we add this to the volume in some way? And then also, how can we really try to link, because I think everyone could see the great range of topics that, this new idea of logistical media invites. How can we have a little glue that kind of tries to bring them together without being too schematic or on the nose?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I remember, it was Nicole's idea to have the intervals. And I agree with Susan that, we all had different kinds of ideas. I mean, it was very much that, again, what John pointed out about vocabulary, what terms, what concepts, what images did we want people to have about these topics that, were in the essays, but not in exactly the way, we wanted or imagined. And there's a little bit of connective, tissue in those intervals that, they are related to the essays, but kind of standing outside of them a little bit. But maybe Nicole will say a little bit more.
It's like I had a secret strategy that you both forgot. No, I think that that's all true, but we also tried to come up with intervals that had some secret piece of each of the essays on either side. And so and then each of us kind of took ones that we were interested in and started the conversation, and then edited each other's and worked to kind of smooth them together as we talked about the essays. And so we're I think, at least from my perspective, trying to experiment with logistical form. Collections work really well. Short pieces in between, sometimes people read them, sometimes they don't. And I was trying to, when I was pushing this interval idea, it was in part, thank you, Ned, for giving the language to try to think about, okay, well, maybe what is this sort of space in between, and how could we just kind of play with that and then take it in a totally different direction. That's not at all what you were talking about. But I think that so for example, I was just pulling up the PDFs, so I started the one and I was really enthusiastic about the forklift in cinema. And so that was something I could write about all day, but then it's it's not really a viable essay to write, or maybe it is to write about the forklift as a kind of cinematic technology. But that was in part inspired by your essay, right? So thinking about actual film production, and then bridging to my essay in terms of the kinds of longstanding technologies that orient production globally and produce new forms of vision. So I felt I was trying to grapple with the things that you were talking about. And I think that from a lot of those, sound from a music container is kind of a bridge from Michael's essay to your essay. Not that they have to be read in between, but I think more there are all these people who are experimenting with form right now. And so I thought what would it look like in an academic context to play around with that? And what does that mean in terms of logistics, or a logistical approach? Is that that's the ground also for the question that I have for everybody, which is anyone could answer. Maybe John, you have an opinion, but I feel like a lot of the time you come up with like, there's a new way of framing, you know, like the processes of like global technological interconnection and like, you know, project, like, you know, global political projects and so on, and resistance, and logistics is like the word right now. And also infrastructure is the word, but infrastructure seems like it's now into, for me, it's like, maybe because I was working on infrastructure and now I'm playing with logistics. So I would say like, but it matters to me, and I think it matters to all of us, that these aren't just words that get thrown around to describe the same process over and over and over again, but there's some sort of specificity to like why we use infrastructure and why we would use logistics and why we would attune to different components of those kind of like global processes of interconnection under these different frames and rubrics. And I guess this is also to say, it matters to me that this is like the logistics of media and it's not infrastructures of media. And that I don't see those necessarily as like firm ontological distinctions, but I think that they are still different, and the way that we use them are different. So I guess this is to any of the contributors, like what are the stakes in describing things, articulating things, and making arguments with each other about logistics or through logistics?
I'll just say that I'm now working on another edited volume with Nicole Rizzuto and Kelly Me Rich, who are here or have been here listening in, and it's on infrastructure. So the difference between logistics and infrastructure is key and important to articulating all the things you just said. We have a kind of a comment question from Honda in the chat. They write, I'm an international student. Today I was at the Amazon warehouse hiring event and nearly all applicants were international students. So part-time international students' role within this so-called supply chain may be a point to note. I think that's crucial and important. Honda, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you want to say more, I think we'd love to hear from you.
Hi, thank you. Yes, today it was a different. I observed a different environment, and it was a first time for me. And when I listened to all these great topics and essays, and yeah, I thought about the international students' role within this North American logistics and supply chain, because nearly all of the applicants were international students, and I know that how precarious can be in these conditions, both being a student and both being an international student in North America. So I just want to say that.
Thank you. And, you know, I think everyone here wants to support you, and, you know, that's part of the project of the volume. So thank you. More questions?
Well, I'll just have a comment if that's okay. I mean, it's, you know, this point and thinking about, you know, Amazon, and this is something we talked about, you know, a lot, and, you know, I'm sure we all talk about. It's interesting that what we think of as some of the biggest logistics companies, you know, irrespective of shipping, the kind of companies that, you know, like the FedEx, you know, UPS, irrespective of that, we're talking about Apple, we're talking about Amazon. You know, Apple makes telephones. They used to make computers. You know, Amazon started as a bookstore. You know, there's a kind of industrial centrality of media to logistics that, you know, I think demands a kind of response from those of us who study media and care about media.
And I guess I just want to add into that, this is for Hyundai and that comment about international students. I think if anyone's interested in this connection in a, you know, kind of as it relates to education, there's an amazing chapter by Marc Bousquet, which talks about how, oh Jesus, which of the big logistics companies is it? Like basically they have a hand in glove in state education, and UPS is it could be any of them. But you know, how they're exploiting student labor and giving kind of, you know, reductions on course fees, tuition fees in order to sort of maintain a workforce that's sort of indentured in a sort of minor way, but you know it's undercut entirely by you know the Louisiana state budget. So it's all of these things are really, it's not like I'm a student and then I go and do this shitty job for Amazon. The two are coming together in really quite frightening ways right now, and thank you very much for raising that connection.
I also just wanted to go back to Nicole's question about what's at stake as we shift maybe from infrastructure to logistics, because I think probably a lot of folks in the book were writing about drawing cues, of course, from Nicole's formative work, drawing initially about infrastructural literature and then shifting over towards logistics for this volume. I think one of the reasons that sound proved a really fruitful, and I'm kind of mixing metaphors here, way of thinking about it for me is that logistics requires us to think about rhythms and the multiple temporalities of systems and infrastructures. You know, typically we talk about infrastructures in terms of layerings or entanglements, but when you talk about logistics, you incorporate a temporal dimension in there as well, and new frictions. So I feel like just realizing the polytemporal dimensions of multiple systems that have to be entangled and working with different logics. So it's kind of the interoperability, going back to something that Ned said earlier. I think these are different kind of dynamics that that logistics brings to the table that maybe complicates the way we used to think about infrastructures.
It looks like Sawa, you have your hand raised. I invite you to speak your question.
Hi, thank you for the talks, everyone. I can't wait to read the book. I haven't, I don't know if it's out yet, but I'm so excited to read it. So I love this idea of logistical media, and I was wondering where, you know, things such as oral communication fit in this idea of supply chain media. Like, how would something like rumor theoretically fit here? And, you know, in this kind of line with recentering frameworks, is there a way to apply concepts about supply chain outside capitalist logics from, you know, particular frameworks, and not to reinforce binaries, but could there even be a non-capitalist logic of supply chain media, or do you think that's theoretically not possible? Again, thank you, everyone.
I could say something just to start us off on those two very rich questions about capitalist supply chains versus communist ones. I think in our volume, the framework is pretty much capitalism. For myself, drawing on Deborah Cowan's work on logistics, it's a crucial kind of critical position to occupy to understand like where the demand for efficiency comes from. That said, I think it would be interesting to try to study communist or socialist logistics and see what the concept morphs into in that context. I'll let others comment who have more to say.
I mean, I don't have anything to say about that, but the question of oral, you know, communication. I mean, I think that, you know, it's interesting that there are, you know, a number of essays that, you know, touch upon, you know, sound and audio, and obviously Shannon's does, and my essay, which I didn't talk about because we talked in our capacity as editors, is about efficiency, and in particular, kind of auditory idea of efficiency that I argue comes up in the 1920s ish time period, and is sort of rehabilitated today every time we're pitched, some smart assistant that we're supposed to talk to, because, our voice, is this sort of direct, unmediated kind of way to control these systems. And, thinking about sound and control and, the rhythm, poetics, dance, right? All these terms have come up a lot. There's something about the essays in this volume, and I think logistics in general, which, as Liam was talking about, ties into technique, right? There's a lot of, interest in logistical systems and counter logistics in techniques, right? How can we control, how can we rework, ways of being in the world that, supply chain capitalism essentially constructs for the people it fits into logistical systems. So in that regard, I think, the ways oral communication get patterned could be thought of in this framework of techniques, right? And, these sort of, logistical techniques imposed from the top. And in that sense, it would be quite interesting to do this comparison, right? The sort of, the capitalism, communism, command economy kind of comparison.
Liam, did you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah. I just wanted to kind of follow up on Matt and Shannon's point. Like, I agree that I think, for me, logistics is such a productive concept because of that temporal dimension. So it's like logistics is the activation of infrastructure. And for me, like, logistical media are the things that perform that activation, or through which those operations kind of unfold. And so what I like about thinking about logistical media is that, like, logistics is a term that is kind of sometimes overdetermined by the fact that it is like a capitalist science of optimization and circulation. But logistical media, or thinking about the logistics of media, kind of helps us push it maybe beyond that capitalist horizon into some of these other registers. So I just want to say that's a really great question, and thanks for putting it on the table for us.
There's a thread in the chat having to do with the orality or the gossip part of Salwa's question, which certainly, Shannon, I agree, connects to Weiwei's essay on laughing. And Hyojung Kim also writes, connects that to the Abdul Malik Simone's concept of people as infrastructure. Any more to say on that part of the topic, or any further questions?
I just also, sorry I spoke before, but I'm just thinking like the logistics of the whisper network, the logistics of refusal, of escape, which is something that I'm sure Ebony and I have both written about, and other of the authors have touched on as well. And then also to this idea of an anti, not necessarily an anti, but a counter or alternative to capitalist form of logistics. One of the things I have looked at in other work is how public libraries and other public knowledge dissemination institutions have drawn processes from the kind of logistical world and used them for creating a commons, repurposing some of the same software and technology, but used it for a dissemination of materials for public good, not necessarily for kind of capitalist enterprise. So just because a technology originates within a capitalist context doesn't necessarily mean that it is doomed to be reproducing those ideologies. It can be used for kind of purposes that are counter to its kind of original function.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate this. I just want to say thank you so much. It's 4 a.m. I'm in Bangladesh, so I'm very happy that the question actually made sense.
Thank you for joining us at a difficult hour and asking a great question. Okay.
I'll jump in, just out of nowhere, I suppose, but from what we've been talking about, I mean, so like, what does logistics enable us to think, and what do logistical media enable us to think? One of the things, God, I've already lost my point. It's terrible. My gosh, my brain just completely did some vacuum cleaning job. I told you I shouldn't have been talking before midday. I'll come back. I'll write it in the chat. I'm sure it'll drift back.
Nicole and I have been having this lively chat that I don't really know how to explain it, but it's really got me thinking about which sort of fundamental social forms are good at logistics and which are not. So I mean, I'm thinking like Innes thoughts and Lewis Mumford thoughts, or Werner Zombart thoughts, and clearly armies are good at logistics, unfortunately, and that's one of the forms of modern capitalism, the warfare state. We all know this, that this is a Mumford Zombart point, that capitalism is like war in the way that it depends upon the complete overturning of inventory. And I mean, that's how you can refresh inventories, through this radical destruction of everything. But they're also interested in court life as a kind of, basic form for production. It's sort of not clear that court life is logistical or infrastructural in the same way, although court life is full of laughter, dance, rhythm, performance, rumor, orality. And then I'm trying to think about, like, religious institutions. Are religious institutions good at logistics? Because as Nicole's point was, governments are bad at logistics. And I think that's a pretty robust generalization. Obviously, we can find exceptions to it. I mean, are religious institutions bad at logistics or good at them? Or is it only in as much as religious institutions are themselves militarized or military-like, take on the form of an army, which is obviously a very old trope for proselytization, if you think about that in terms of colonization or empire or whatever. So I don't know if anyone can help me think through sort of the state market palace contrast here about who does logistics well, who doesn't. I don't know, Nicole, I don't know if I'm representing our conversation well, but please jump in.
Yeah, no, I think that was great. I feel like it would be, you also have to extend it temporally though, because it doesn't always happen. Like infrastructures, often the narratives are like, there's the construction of infrastructure phase, right? And then there's the infrastructures get used in a multitude of ways, the infrastructures of the state, urban infrastructures. And so infrastructure of then produces and enables a set of like social processes. And then infrastructures like sort of degrade, need to be updated, and enable different kinds of social processes over time. But logistics seems like, so if you say cities are good at infrastructures, well, like, or city planners are good at planning infrastructures, and they build infrastructures. I just like shoot that to Shannon when we need like substantiation for any of the things that I'm broadly generalizing about that I don't know about. But I think if you say X entity is good at infrastructure, usually it's like good at constructing and good at allowing room for social practices to emerge. But to say something is good at logistics is, I think, a different kind of project, right? Because like armies are good at logistics sometimes. They aspire to be good at logistics all the time. And sometimes when they're not good at logistics, the whole thing crumbles, right? And so I think with religious institutions, that seems like, well, certainly many are good at infrastructures, but not always. And logistics seems like it at certain moments when logistics gets taken up, again, not knowing the history of religious infrastructures, but you could speak on this. It seems like at certain moments when logistics gets taken up in order to activate whatever processes or practices or dynamism that comes up. And so you could get good at logistics for a moment, and that would produce something. But I think it's maybe harder to sustain always good at logistics. That's all.
Yeah, we were basically trying to figure out logistics versus infrastructure, I think, right? And some are good at infrastructure, some aren't. I don't know. But yeah, your point about temporality and your point about failure, the kind of necessary failure for either of these. I don't know.
Failure probably looks different, right? failed infrastructures, I think we would all just call that, right? Like whatever our subjects and topic of study, like, you know, a failed infrastructure when you see one, and a failed logistical plan or logistical system looks somewhat different. And I don't know what that is. And maybe someone should write, like when you all write books, then I will know.
Well, part of that is the relation between logistics and contingency. And logistics can handle contingency, whereas perhaps infrastructure can't so well.
When John, you began talking about setting up that question, Dylan wrote in the chat, yes, and racial capitalism actually is war, which is certainly the case, and reminds me of Brett Nielsen's gosh, I'm sorry, I've forgotten his co-writer.
Sandro Mazatra.
Sandro Mazatra, thank you, Ned. Their point that I believe it's both of them, that logistics is haunted by the thesis of the militarization of society, which is, I think, also certainly true. And Megan Weisner, I'm not sure if you're responding to Dylan's thread, but Megan wrote, I was thinking about Ned's comment about using logistical media theory to move towards a political theory of media, or a way to grasp the political outside of political theory, and definitely without a traditional concept of the political subject. It seems that this carries across the essays. I wonder if more of the contributors have thoughts on this. What's exciting about this sort of move, and what pitfalls there might be? Did anyone want to take up this question about political theory and the political subject and the political outside?
I mean, part of it comes down to just how impoverished, in a way, disciplines are when they don't, join in the promiscuous party. And political theory runs up against its limits, it seems, again and again and again. You could say that about any discipline. But how to have a more expansive concept of politics beyond, I don't know, the problem of deliberation or what have you, in order to think, well, the vast richness of the relation between politics and subjectivity, has to kind of include these media and infrastructure that run through our lives in a way that, clearly isn't the case in a more classical conceptions of politics as that which concerns a very kind of restrictive and static idea of the state or something like that. And maybe we see this as well with the increasing disaffection that we read about and sense and experience around politics and the state, and therefore a need to think other kinds of forms of formation, if you like, around political subjectivity.
Okay, thank you, Ned. Did that also get into your question of the problem of determinism?
In part, but not entirely. It's just, I guess, another kind of disciplinary problem. When was determinism, going on in media theory or media studies or something like that? And maybe from the 40s to the 70s, you could get away with speaking like that. And then, determinism or determination kind of got smuggled but not acknowledged through things like STS and feminist theory, to an extent, also around the question of agency. So we're fine to talk about things like agency and shaping, right? The shaping of things. STS loves to talk about shaping. But they don't like to take the next step and say how something is determined. But sometimes things are determined, and yet we are not comfortable still invoking that term to describe that type of force. And so one of the things I find intriguing, I guess, about logistical media is it does prompt that thinking around determination and determinism once again.
That point reminds me of a couple of our contributors who are not here, but who have a wonderful essay in the volume, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, in their book, The Undercommons, have a way of writing about logistics that makes it the subject of a sentence and almost personifies it when they talk about logistics seeks to do this or aims to do this, or, you know, whatever it may be, that, you know, could express that kind of determinism. Becomes an interesting matter for how to write about logistics at the level of the sentence grammatically.
Yeah, I'll also say, like, one of the things that was really great about putting this collection together, and I think that we agreed upon, and just to go to, you know, that Fred Moten and Stefano's essay, is that you don't find that to talk about logistics, we actually need many, like, it's not, there are already many ways of talking about logistics, some which discuss it and attribute agency to it and use it strategically, just as logistics is a strategic art in itself, right? So it also seems to invite that kind of play from the people who write about it. And I think that one of the challenges in this collection, but also like my favorite parts of it, is that you don't find, like, maybe you all, but like people who are working on this, like who are working on, you know, like, who are working in German media theory at the same time as like the same conversations as people who are like thinking about, like, you know, Susan, like your essay on, like, you know, the history of, you know, the bill of lading, like, at the same time as you're thinking about like contemporary film production and offshoring, right? Like there are all these different discussions in which you just tend to have people talking amongst themselves about the kinds of logistics and then using the language and kind of discussion of logistics or logistics as in those ways. And I think that, like, what I thought was so beautiful about all of your contributions is that there are these like inflection points across them, where I feel like in reading them, I start to see the possibilities for logistics and see how critical, or see, I guess, like something that I didn't understand before, having just sat from within one of those sort of disciplines or projects. And that's something that I see possible with logistics that was a little bit more difficult with infrastructure.
Can I just jump in really quick with sort of a throwaway thing that makes reference to Matt's question about what does being good at logistics look like? So from Canada, this is not my point. I'm part of a reading group, and this was my friend Henry Speck's point. But from Canada, it was really interesting looking at the vaccine rollout. And Henry's point was that America is really, really good when you ask it to mobilize and move around. And it's really, really bad when you ask it to sit still. So lockdowns in America were very different than they were in Canada, where we're really good. If you ask us to sit in place and follow a rule, we're great. But then you ask us to roll out a vaccine and it's like catastrophic, right? And in that was really starkly thrown into relief from our position to your north.
Yeah, the vaccine rollout is certainly an object of logistical fascination for me. And who knows how long that will continue. There's also a strand in our chat. Tom writes about the US progressive movement in politics. Dean Obama Sanders has embraced a logistical vision as central strategic alternative to Clintonian fundraising politics. And Shannon offers that so much of mutual aid is also affected through logistics. Comments there?
I just think it's interesting how it's almost like the domestication of logistics. There were so many think pieces written throughout the pandemic about the rise of Google Docs and other types of kind of collaborative media, often bureaucratic media, as a way of organizing people to provide community services and mutual aid, for instance. So it's taking these administrative software, enterprise software, which Ned, I know, has written a lot about, and turning them into domestic tools for community organizing.
Okay, well, we're approaching the 90-minute mark. Let me ask if anyone has a last question or comment that they would like to jump in with before we finish up. Okay, well, thank you, everyone, Carla and Veronica and other people writing nice things in the chat. Thank you for coming. Let me just say a few things to say that I'd like to thank Nicole and Matt, for being fabulous co-editors. And Nicole, in my memory of this is that the edited volume was your idea. But maybe I'm misremembering that. I'm happy to take credit for it, but let's take the credit together. But really what I want to say to you is that you've done this in the past, and for me it was a real masterclass in learning how to co-edit a volume. So I wanted to thank you for all of the wisdom that you imparted, in the process of it. And Matt, I want to thank you too for just all of your precision and attention to detail, and pitching in on every last task that we had to do together. It was an absolute delight to work with you too. And for all of our contributors, I can't say how proud I am of this volume, because of each essay is just fantastic. I hope that this volume sort of gets the reputation that it really deserves, because I think every single chapter, is making an impact in multiple fields, and it's just such a truly valuable thing to have all of your work together here. And it's been so lovely to have this event and finally get to talk to all of you and meet you, some of you, for the first time, and of course to see old friends with whom I've met before. But it's lovely that we can get to do this, and I'm not sad that we're not doing it in person, because I don't think we would all have been there if that were the case. So I want to see this as a Zoom silver lining. And thank you, audience members, for coming and asking questions and engaging us. We hope you enjoy the book. I should also thank Duke University Press for producing the book to a high standard. Anyone else would like to say anything? Thank you for putting these wonderful comments here in the chat at the end. Okay, then thank you all so much, and I will see you and talk to you down the road.